also find this a beautiful place to sit?" she asks with a clear and distinct voice. He is surprised by her directness and the fact that she doesn't have her sister's accent. "Indeed," he says, "this is one of the most beautiful spots in Den Bosch, and that's why I find it so unfortunate that the old V&D restaurant is no longer here. It's now the storefront of a sports store. You had a very nice view over the markt from there, just like at McDonald's. Speaking of environmental pollution. But I digress. How is your sister and the children?" "Good," Thea replies. "It was her idea to visit you because she saw in your eyes that you knew and understood a little more about why she was so fearful. She told me later that after the interview with you, she felt more confident, as if you had given her some sort of strength. I then told her that I had filmed footage of the market and didn't hand it over because I had taken it with my new mobile phone. And after the explosion, which occurred before Wilder's car, I immediately fled the scene, still in shock from the events and not immediately thinking about that mobile phone. It was only a few days later that I dared to view the footage, and I tell you, afterwards I hyperventilated for half an hour. The footage was so shocking." Rulin saw her eyes begin to sparkle, stirred his coffee, and took a bite of the always delicious, fresh quality offered by this store. "Take a bite first, and then continue. It tastes as good as ever," he suddenly says in his Bosch dialect, and sees her start to laugh. "Yes, my sister is very good at that dialect. She likes to speak in her own dialect because she finds it clearer so she understands better what people mean. The flat Bosch dialect is short, simple, and direct. She always says, 'Just be normal, that's crazy enough.'" Now he started to laugh. "But yeah, nowadays everyone in the business world speaks standard Dutch, and you won't get far with your dialect. That's the reality," she says after taking a sip of her coffee. "Although I do find it a pity, the Bosch dialect has a nice sound and always sounds pleasantly theatrical." She took another sip of coffee and continued the story. "An old German teacher once told the class that the Bosch dialect is excellent for learning to speak a foreign language. The theatrical exaggeration when speaking the dialect can be applied to any foreign language, making it sound very close to the original pronunciation. I've never looked at it that way, but it could be quite accurate," says Roland interestedly. "Where is the mobile phone now?" he asks. As she opens her bag and hands the mobile phone to Roland, her hand touches his, and he feels a slight tremor. "Here," she says. "Do you know how it works?" Roland nods and immediately starts to look at the photos on the mobile phone. After viewing the 4 photos, one of which is a bit blurry, he sighs deeply and says that this is very explosive material. "This must stay between us. Does anyone besides your sister know about these photos?" "No," she replies kindly and seems somewhat more reassured now that she knows the photos are in good hands. Roland suggests giving him some time to discuss with Frank Verhofstadt what should be done with this new evidence. They both finish their coffee and chat about that strange day in May. Later that evening, during the pre-discussion for the Friday program Focus, Roland took Frank aside for a moment. "I need to show you something very important." Frank, somewhat surprised, looks at Roland and sees from the look in his eyes that it must be very important. "What do you have?" he asks. "I had a conversation with the woman at the well. Turns out she's a sister of the woman I interviewed earlier during my Mossport reportage. See how small the world is? Well, she took some interesting photos during the attack on the market. I've seen them. They're shocking and could cause a lot of uproar. The meaning of freedom and honesty is grossly violated here. The photos show a Moroccan man being shot by a security guard near Wilder's car. You can clearly see in the first photo someone with a drawn gun shooting at the man in the robe. In the second, you see that the man has disappeared. Strikingly clear is the back of Wilder's, already lying diagonally on the back seat. I can confirm this. That's how he was lying." Frank was shocked, fearing that one of his worst nightmares would come true, and immediately realized that these photos would cause a huge scandal and might even mean the end of our democracy. His brain worked rapidly, and he asked where Roland had stored the photos and if they were safe. Roland had loaded them onto a PC that was not connected to the internet and said that this somewhat older machine was in his attic, a kind of nostalgia. Frank urged him not to speak to anyone about this and asked if he had told the woman about it as well. Roland reassured him. I talked to her about it, and she knows what's at stake. She's a sensible woman. It was just a conversation and we weren't bugged or anything, I think. Although you do become paranoid with all these strange thoughts going through your head, he says, but regains composure and says it was just a conversation over coffee, nothing more. Frank was satisfied. He reassured Roland and said it would be fine and that he first had to arrange some things like the conversation with the two suspected terrorists. First things come first, he thought, and went to the meeting. The topic of the evening would be the poor mortgage market in America and its potential consequences, a complicated matter. Bosch was doing financially well in the meantime, and they benefited from it by replacing their outdated equipment with better and more modern materials. Frank was sitting on the toilet an hour before the broadcast when his phone rang. He truly disliked this. Mobile phone calls, convenient and fun as they may be, leave no privacy in such moments, and you feel compelled to answer, afraid it might be important. It becomes even worse when the caller doesn't call back, especially when you were expecting an important call. So, annoyance on his part. Nevertheless, he picks up and takes a deep breath. Hello, crackles from the speaker. This is Frank Verhofstadt. Who am I speaking with? He asks. It's not good. It's all wrong. Not good. Allah Akbar. He hears the click, and it goes silent. He checks his phone's window for a possible number. Private, it says, which means no number to call back. Shit, he shouts loudly, the sound echoing in the hollow space. I'm slowly going crazy, he thinks, and tears overwhelm him for a moment, realizing he's neck deep in it. Shit, 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 he says again while splashing a handful of water from the sink onto his face, looking at his weathered face in the mirror. He's annoyed by the strange call, but has an idea of who it might be. This thought gives him some courage again, and he returns to the canteen. Peter, also present that evening, and greatly enjoying himself with his passion for creating and brainstorming television formats, sits at a table, sipping a cup of coffee. He appreciated that his questions during Focus on Friday were appreciated by a large viewing and listening audience. Focus on Friday. John Lee Hooker, Blues Before Sunrise. Good evening, dear listeners and viewers. Welcome to another episode of Focus on Friday. I welcome our guests, Peter Teteru, for the necessary questions and objective view on matters, and via satellite, the man with the sexiest voice in Holland and America, Walter Kroes. Good evening, gentlemen. Wishing you a good evening from the man with a somewhat less sexy voice, but with one of the 7 beauties, as I have a dimple in my chin. Haha. Also a very good evening to you all there. To start, I'd like to give Walter the opportunity to tell us about the current situation in the USA and how he's doing as a journalist. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'd like to take this moment to say that things are not going very well in this once free country. The economy is showing more and more cracks. The debt burden, mainly due to the war in Iraq, exceeds the income. American companies are closing their doors or being replaced by foreign ones, which are after the low wages of illegal workers, for example, the Mexicans. This comes at the expense of the expensive American worker, who, due to the closure of the company, loses his job and often his pension as well. A lot of work is being done in government-funded projects by very cheap Chinese labor, while the war industry is booming, and companies like Halliburton are making millions in profits in Iraq by building bases for troops. Bush Sr. has already made a fortune from it, as has Dick Cheney. A lot of money disappears in defense in what they call black ops. Black operations that finance billion-dollar projects that the ordinary citizen knows nothing about, while it's their hard-earned dollar that disappears into an infinitely deep pit and is likely used against them rather than in their favor. That's quite a heavy statement you're making there, Frank. What do you base that on? It's quite simple. With the internet now, people get access to information that is not intended for the general public sooner. Those black ops are not called that for nothing. Where computers are used, there is data traffic, and if that is made accessible in any way, through a mistake, a leak, or worse, a hacker, it quickly becomes accessible on the internet. If you do this from an island without government control, there's no one to stop it. They make sure the public is informed about the obscure affairs the high-placed elite engage in with the help of banks. This is becoming increasingly clear. America is heading for a recession to introduce the new currency, the Amero, and bring both continents, think of Europe, back into balance and take away more and more rights and money from the citizens. Third world conditions already prevail here due to the collapse of the housing market and the sky-high debts Americans have. Due to borrowing heavily with hardly anything as collateral and no work, they are now forced to leave their homes and are already living with 130,000 compatriots in an African-like tent camp near the city of San Francisco. 2 garden hoses for water and 3 toilets. No electricity, nothing, just their pride. Alzheimer's patients are implanted with a radio frequency identification chip to help them avoid getting lost. And this is sold as an invention to improve quality of life, while it's nothing more than a step towards chipping an entire population. Frank, I'd like to leave it here for now. After these strong words from Walter, it's time for some music. News and updates by Jose de Court. Just now, our newsroom received a report that in the heavily guarded prison in Vught, the bodies of the 2 terrorism suspects, AD and HD, have been found in their cell. As it appears now, both men have taken their own lives with a suicide pill. In a letter found in one of the cells, the following text, released by the Public Prosecution Service, was found. Rather to die as martyrs than to be imprisoned like cowardly dogs by unbelieving dogs, those worshippers of Satan, Allah Akbar. Further news will follow. The weather, unchanged and stormy. Frank, we're back after this short interruption. And guys, what news again? Well, that's something. You'll see more and more police on the streets now. I've already heard that our troops are being withdrawn from Uruzgan and will now help the government maintain peace in the country. Those thoughts were there indeed, but they will probably be accelerated now by this news. I mean, they are now more in danger there, and here we can use them if heavy riots break out again. But is this a good development, and are we not going too far in implementing violence and military presence in collaboration with the police? It becomes truly frightening when you see this happening in your own country. Here in the States, the police have been working together with the well-known private army of Blackwater corporations for a long time, an organization of well-paid veterans volunteers. In other words, people who support any goal for the most money and do not shy away from violence, a group of fanatical, trigger-happy cowboys who have long fought alongside soldiers in Iraq and are feared for their use of violence and intimidation. A gang of outlaws, so quite typical American. During the flooding in New Orleans, they worked together with the police and confiscated citizens' weapons and searched houses. A large number of former military bases are or are being converted into detention camps. Platforms with chained chairs have been installed, and large areas with names like Green and Red Area, fenced off with barbed wire, are set up. Will these serve as refugee camps or detention camps in case of a possible virus outbreak? And why the chains? The camera surveillance, the windowless buildings, and the large freight wagons photographed, twice the size of a normal one. What are they transporting? And why are there nocturnal terrorist exercises in medium-sized cities where they don't hesitate to detain, arrest, and snoop around the private affairs of ordinary, unsuspecting citizens, such as a car? While Walter was elaborating on his account, Frank stepped out of the studio because he had been signaled that he had received an important private phone call. Once outside the studio, he took out his mobile phone and heard the voice of Everett Willink, the lawyer of the 2 suspects. "Good evening, Mr. Verhofstadt." It sounded very formal. "Good evening," he replied and took a seat in one of the chairs in the control room adjacent to the studio. "I understand that the tragic news regarding my clients has already reached you. I'm calling you to arrange a meeting with you as soon as possible to discuss this surprising turn of events in this already strange story." Frank agreed to this, and they arranged to meet the next Monday morning at a neutral location in the city center. The agreed-upon place was Klein 79, a cafe restaurant opposite the HEMA. It's time for some good music and a little break. See you soon. Slade, in for a penny. We're back for the last part of the program. There have been some heavy discussions here, and in my opinion, we're heading into quite a tumultuous period. You can say that again, now that the RFID chip is becoming commonplace, and they've already started tagging livestock, whether it's chickens or cows, with such a chip. Farmers are furious, being driven to high costs, and essentially, they no longer own their livestock in this way. Also, Bosch recently passed a new law in which he cannot be held liable for the misdeeds he has committed so far. Charges of mass murder are no longer applicable, and he can never be prosecuted for them at least. Peter, what about the Amero? The Amero is definitely coming. You see, it works like this. First, they create a problem. That's the recession. The people start to grumble, ask for a solution, and then they get it in the form of the Amero. The value of the dollar is plummeting rapidly and is now almost on par with the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso. The merging of these three countries and their economies mainly benefits the Mexican and current American government. Due to the influx of cheap Mexican labor and the disappearance of borders, Americans are forced to lower their wage demands to have any chance of getting work. Superhighways are being built from Mexico City to Quebec under the auspices of NAFTA and other bureaucratic, non-legally formed entities. The Council on Foreign Relations, with many prominent figures, both Republicans and Democrats, including Barack Obama, is an institution formed in this way. The danger of the many new laws like the Patriot Act has awakened the citizens, and the aversion to the policy of the cowboy Bush and his outlaws grows every day. Only the demonstrations are not shown by the major networks. They provide the distraction. TV networks are more concerned with what's happening in Europe and China regarding human rights. They're secretly not so concerned because the American government has always financially supported the Chinese, and China serves as a model state for America. Many hard workers with few rights and huge profits are what they themselves have in mind with the plans concerning the Amero.